Alright, so now we are on to our second goal for the Progressive Era, and that is to analyze the different groups of Americans that made economic and political gains during the Progressive period. So we kind of talked about the first section, the first quick recording we did of this whole unit, about the events that kind of led to progressivism kind of popping up in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And now we're going to talk about who actually got the benefit of it and how those benefits manifested. Alright, so take a look at this quick cartoon. One of the big issues during the Progressive Era are the issues of trusts and monopolies. And trust and monopolies, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. They're basically organizations of companies that stifle or end competition. That's essentially what they are. And we're going to talk about the impact of things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, different various acts that stop trust and monopolies from having too much power. All right, so first things first. The Sherman Antitrust Act was in 1890. Now, it made it illegal to form trusts that interfered with free trade between states or other countries. Now, early on, it was very ineffective against business because the Interstate Commerce Clause hadn't really expanded that much to include intrastate activity that affects interstate activity. So most of what actually happened was it wasn't really used against businesses. It was used instead the damaged labor unions who were organizing and damaging things like free trade between states. So it was kind of misused in a way for a good period of time. A good example of this would be the U.S. versus the E.C. Knight Company. Basically, it's a ruling that this was a ruling against the government that wanted to break up certain monopolies. So this is the U.S. government petitioning to break up some monopolies. Now, the court ruled that Congress could not regulate intrastate commerce. That means commerce back and forth inside of a state. However, they could regulate interstate or across state line commerce. This related to the sugar trust. So basically, this is the sugar companies all together stifling competition. I think something like 98% of the sugar companies were owned by E.C. Knight and various other subsidiaries. This was an attempt to break up that monopoly, and it just didn't work because the sugar trust would argue that their actions were all intrastate. They have it inside state lines. All right, then we got Northern Securities v. U.S. This is in 1904, so check out the dates. These are almost 10 years apart from each other. This Supreme Court case dissolved the company because it had monopolistic policies. This is like a big railroad case. It was the first big win against these big monopolies, and this was filed by Teddy Roosevelt. And TDR, Teddy Roosevelt, was very well known as a trust buster. He was anti-monopoly. He wanted to promote business. He was a Republican president that took over after McKinley was assassinated. There's my phone going off, so incredibly unprofessional. All right, so there's Teddy Roosevelt and the cartoonist basically showing him as like a safari hunter, basically taking out the bad trusts and keeping the good trusts. So the idea of a monopoly, there were some monopolies that weren't bad, and in this case, trusts were just groups of companies that combined together to make monopolies. Sometimes they didn't always stifle competition. Sometimes it was just they'd all join under one big umbrella. But more often than not, it was anti-competition, pro-business, and kind of hurt the little guy, made it to where they couldn't do business the way they needed to do it, made goods go up in cost and go down in quality because there's no reason to actually make better goods because there was no competition. All right, so one big thing that Teddy Roosevelt's known for is his conservation. So check out this list. These are various places of conserved federal land, and these are considered public lands that anybody can access. There's some North Carolina. Out in the Midwest, there's a ton. There's a whole heck of a lot in California, the Redwood Forest, and all those various places. All right, the Elkins Act. Now, take a look at that cartoon at the bottom right. That is the traditional symbol of the GOP, or the Republican Party, is the elephant. Traditional symbol of the Democrat Party is the donkey on the right. All right, so in 1906, it made it illegal for railroad officials to give shippers or to... I'm sorry, I got to re-say that just because I'm tired right now. Sorry about that. It made it illegal for railroad officials to give or for shippers to receive rebates for using certain railroads. So basically, railroad companies were giving what's called kickbacks, which is basically like, here's some money for you using our shipping line. So you pay a lot up front, and then we give you a bunch back in the form of kickbacks to get you to use our railroads instead of anything else. It was basically what it amounted to was bribing shippers for using their stuff. It was very it was almost like legal corruption, but this made it illegal, so they could no longer do that. All right, this is some North Carolina specific stuff right here. So we got American Tobacco v. U.S. So we're talking about the Duke family here, like Duke University. 1911 Supreme Court case ruled that the Duke family had established an illegal monopoly over the tobacco industry, and the court ordered that the company be broken up. And simple as that. Now there's Duke Power, Duke University. There's so many various areas where the Duke family has influence in just a history of North Carolina. All right, the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1913. It made monopolies illegal and protected the rights of the unions. It was proposed by Woodrow Wilson, so the president after Teddy Roosevelt. From 1913 to 1921. He's also our World War I president. And so there's a cartoon of Wilson basically saying antitrust legislation will basically create better business because guess what? If you legislate away the ability of trusts and monopolies to form, there's more competition. And competition, if you've had economics yet, tends to promote higher quality of goods and lower prices, which tends to boost the economy in general. All right, so workers' rights and the progressive movement. So we've talked about some of the Gilded Age flaws. In this case, we're talking about sweatshops again. It was names given to factories in urban cities that were often targets of progressive movements because the conditions were so squalid and terrible. All right, the Haymarket Riot. We've talked about this once already, but basically this puts an end to the Knights of Labor as a union. This is where there was a big riot in Chicago where some police officers were killed, and there was a firebomb thrown, there was a fire started, and basically turned people's opinions against the unions. This is 1886, but we're talking about the later part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, so that slowly that whole anti-union feel is starting to go away. All right, and then you have the anthracite coal strike, 1902. Basically, here's what happened. So President Roosevelt, he threatens to take over the West Virginia coal mines with the use of U.S. troops when 150,000 coal miners walked off the job demanding better pay. So basically, this is the first time labor was actually supported by the government. So they go on strike, and then Teddy Roosevelt says, if you can't negotiate better rates and take care of your employees, I'm going to send in federal troops, and we're going to take over your coal mine, and you won't have a coal mine to profit from anymore. So, and this also leads to the United Mine Workers Union of America, all these various labor unions that are still in existence today. So this is where the government actually backed up labor unions, where traditionally governments did not back up labor unions because they tended to interfere with economics by just stopping labor and stopping the economy. Go ahead, pause it here, open a new YouTube window, and find the song Big Bad John and listen to it. It's basically about a coal miner and talking about, how terrible the conditions in coal mines were. And basically a guy named Big Bad John who dies in a coal mine and the story of him. It's kind of cool. And this is probably what Big Bad John would look like. This is a cartoon from the time basically saying that the miners had won a victory here. The mine owners, they were like the big wigs, fat cats. They had all this money. They didn't actually work in the mine. The miners did all the hard work and got nothing for it. It's kind of like a victory of the little guy over the big business fat cats and all those folks. Excuse me. So Teddy Roosevelt was a hero to the mine workers union. Like they campaigned for him. They were super appreciative of all the work that they did for him because basically, remember, there was a history of unions being broken up by government. In this case, the government backed up the unions under Teddy Roosevelt. All right, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, 1909. All right, this is a compromise. And what it was supposed to do was moderate the rate of a tariff. A tariff is just a tax on imports. But it raised the tariff on a lot of items, and it angered progressives because they felt it reversed or slowed some of their reforms. It was signed by Taft into law, and this is where you start seeing a split of the Republican Party. So we had Teddy Roosevelt being Republican, then Taft becomes the president, and he is also Republican, and these actually they're on good terms with each other. But Teddy Roosevelt did not agree with this. He thought it was a bad idea, but Taft signed into law anyway. And this starts to lead into a schism in the Republican Party, and which leads to Woodrow Wilson eventually being elected. All right, so there's President H. Taft from 1909 to 1913. In 1921, he's appointed to the Supreme Court. And if you know much history about Taft, you'll find that he hated being president with a passion. Didn't like it. Didn't even consider it a major accomplishment. His big thing, because his history was as a judge, he wanted to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. That's what he wanted all his life, and he got it eventually. All right, the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 expanded the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC at the time, and their responsibilities now include regulation of phone, telegraph, and cable companies. So nowadays you would think like the FCC, but back then the Interstate Commerce Commission would be the FCC. I'm sorry, the ICC at the time. Originally, the ICC only regulated the railroads, but now they've expanded into things that like utilities, what we call utilities now, telephone, cable, all that stuff. They've expanded the role of the U.S. federal government into different spheres, because we've had these inventions like the telegraph, telephone for decades now, but there's no real rule on who regulates them. This law basically establishes that the Interstate Commerce Commission, their job is also to regulate these various forms of utilities because they cross state lines all the time, they affect interstate commerce, and so on. All right, so here's a quick summary of how different members of various political parties, when they became president, the progressive ideas they put through. So you'll notice that both parties are involved here. So it's not like both parties had progressive wings at the time that had a lot of power. All right, so Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909, a.k.a. Teddy. He actually didn't like that nickname, by the way. He was a conservator of natural resources. He established a lot of national parks that still exist today. He was a trust buster. He filed 44 antitrust lawsuits. Taft, very similar, but filed 90 antitrust lawsuits, but he was pro-business. So he was like, I like business and competition, but I only like business if there's competition. So he filed a lot of antitrust lawsuits, but he was also pro-business on the other side of things. Then you got Woodrow Wilson after Taft, the Federal Reserve Act, which we'll talk about in a little while, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which we just went over, and he lowered tariffs. And tariffs, again, are taxes on imports, and the cheaper your imports are, the cheaper it is for people to sell them, which increases business. That's why nowadays, anytime someone brings up tariffs, like if Trump were to talk about tariffs, it scares business owners because tariffs increase the cost of goods to consumers, which means consumers won't buy them. So if you have a pair of shoes that cost $100 and you put a 10% tariff on it, well, now they're $110, and you can see how that can kind of snowball in effect. If you put a tariff on everything, everything's more expensive, less gets purchased, then all of a sudden you have the economy tanking. All right, Taft, this isn't really related to the class, but it's kind of funny. This is President, later Justice Taft's bathtub. Taft was the fattest U.S. president in history, and at one point got stuck in his bathtub, and that's why he has this giant bathtub. 7 feet long, almost 3.5 feet wide. That's a big doggone bathtub, guys. That's huge. That would be like well over 100 gallons of water, well over. So you're talking about a lot of dude going in this bathtub. Notice you got 4 guys in there right now, and Taft would fill that by himself. So he was a big dude. All right, this is Roosevelt hunting in Africa with his Model 1895 Winchester. Now, he was a safari kind of guy. He was he was a hero of the Spanish-American War. He was also a conservationist, which sounds kind of weird after he just clearly here shot and killed a rhinoceros, which nowadays we consider an endangered species. But at the time, going on safari in Africa would be like going on a hunting trip to Wyoming to shoot deer. Like it was more expensive, but the idea was you shot big game, water buffalo, things that nowadays that we just like be sickened by because we're like, don't kill those beautiful animals. There's not many left. They're going to go extinct. They weren't in danger of extinction at that time, but nowadays they are just because the influence of people coming in, taking over the ivory trade certainly with rhinoceros and elephants, all very negative, terrible stuff. But at the time, part of being a conservationist is actually hunting, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but one of the problems, especially in this country, is things like deer and bear and other various large animals. If they don't have a natural predator, they just keep breeding and making more, and eventually what can happen is they can starve to death, resources go down. Deer around here, people hit them with their car all the time, get killed in car accidents. Nowadays, part of conservation is the hunting of animals to ensure that they are there at a good population to be healthy and breeding. All right, so the Progressive Bull Moose Party. So the Bull Moose Party is an outgrowth of Teddy Roosevelt. So it was founded by Teddy Roosevelt after he lost the Republican nomination to Taft. So Taft beat him out for the 1912 election candidacy. So basically, Teddy Roosevelt didn't like what Taft was doing. So he ran against him in the primary, trying to get nominated, didn't win. And so Teddy says, well, fine. Screw you guys, I'm going to go make my own political party. It's going to be better than all of yours. So he goes off, makes the Bull Moose Party. Now, here's the problem with that. It's not like the Bull Moose Party was its own set of ideas. It basically split the Republican Party. He took the half that liked Taft and the half that liked Teddy Roosevelt and split them apart from each other. And the way our electoral college system works is you have to get at least 51% of the votes in any given state to win anything. So when you have your party split two ways, getting to 50% plus one extra vote is next to impossible. And you're going to see the breakdown in just a minute of what that looks like at the electoral college level. All right, so Woodrow Wilson eventually wins this election, but he only won because of the split in the Republican vote, because Taft and Teddy Roosevelt split their Republican Party between the Republican and the Bull Mooses. And here's a quick cartoon of what's going on. So you have Teddy Roosevelt kind of straddling these two horses, and he's just basically he's splitting up this party, and people didn't like him for it, but people also loved him for it. Kind of like how even when Trump does something bad that people don't like, the other half still like him for it because he's being different. It's very strange. But at the time, it was kind of the same situation. You had somebody who was really kind of damaging the Republican Party by going out and forming his own party to take away votes, but people still loved him for it because he was more progressive than Taft was. All right, then you can see Uncle Sam being the referee between Taft and Roosevelt. And remember, Taft and Roosevelt are really members of the same party. And now they're beating the crap out of each other. And the only winner in this case ends up being Woodrow Wilson, because Taft and Roosevelt are so busy fighting that they lose the vote and Wilson wins. All right, so there's the president. Take a look at these three pictures and just note the times. You had Teddy Roosevelt 1901, 1909. Then Taft served one term. And then Woodrow Wilson gets in the office for 2 terms. And he's also our World War I president. All right, so check this cartoon out. So you see Uncle Sam up here, and you see Taft fighting with Roosevelt. So who's missing? Who's missing in this cartoon? Who's the benefiter? Who's actually the one that's going to get the benefit out of this entire exchange? Boom, Woodrow Wilson. Why? Because these two were so busy fighting each other that he ended up sweeping all the electoral votes in the electoral college, because he could reach that 50% plus one extra vote, or a majority vote in the states. And then you got the stereotypical Teddy Roosevelt smile on this moose. And they're calling him the latest arrival to the political zoo, because animals typically represented different parties. Like there was the Tammany tiger, the Democrat donkey, and the GOP had the elephant. And there's Taft trying to cut in and say that Teddy Roosevelt can't be dancing with the GOP lady. Oh, then you also have a bust. There's one thing that I don't always notice in this cartoon, but you got a bust of Lincoln right here, kind of glaring at them like, you idiots, what are y'all doing? Because Lincoln was the first Republican Party president. All right, and here is what the electoral votes look like. Now, to win the Electoral College, you have to get 270 votes. Wilson won in a landslide because Roosevelt and Taft split their votes up, which meant they hardly ever got to that point of a majority vote. And this is what it looked like. So you have all these states in that blue color. That's Woodrow Wilson. Now, Taft won a couple states. He won Utah, oddly enough, and he also won Vermont. Everybody else went either for Theodore Roosevelt or they went for Woodrow Wilson. Now, Roosevelt won more, which is kind of telling, because these are, like, especially Michigan, Pennsylvania, you have a whole lot of union activity out here. California, you had a lot of activity. Remember, California at this time, 13 electoral college. It's got 55 now. California was still very much like the old West, because you went out there and it was just, there wasn't much activity outside of the railroad being built in the ports from Asia. So you had a very small population out here. So look, you got North Carolina with 12 electoral votes and California with 13. They're almost equal. Now it's like 15 to 55. New York is obviously the biggest state at this time period. And then you got Illinois because of Chicago. Essentially what's happened here is, because Taft and the Roosevelt split their vote, they couldn't win the majority in most of these states, which meant that Woodrow Wilson got the majority and would win them by landslides. Now, eventually, after Woodrow Wilson is unelected, or after he ran his 2 terms and a new president came in, Taft is appointed to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. So there he is, right in the middle. Then you got Oliver Wendell Holmes right here, and those are the 2 probably most famous members of the court at that time. All right, so on to the Federal Reserve Act of 1914. This basically was established under Woodrow Wilson. It established a banking system for the entire entire country. Now, I'm not talking about like BB&T and Wells Fargo. I'm talking about the Federal Reserve, like the bank that the government uses to loan out money to banks. That's what we're talking about. And there's various Federal Reserve districts. There's a quick map of them down at the bottom right. There's a total of 12. And there's a bigger version of the same map. And if you look where those blue dots are, that is where each of those individual Federal Reserves are located. So they tend to be located in the largest cities within each of these districts. So Dallas in Texas, San Francisco, which at the time would have been the biggest city. You also got Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, all these really, really big cities within these districts. Now, the Federal Reserve is more famously known as where we keep all the gold. That's where all the gold is, right? That's essentially where it's being kept. And for a long time, the value of U.S. money was tied directly to a value of gold. I think it became like every $33 that you had in your hand was the equivalent to 1 ounce of gold in the Federal Reserve, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. And eventually we get off the gold standard and go to what we call a free-floating system, where our money is just valued in comparison to other governments, other monies. That kind of is more like the stock market and less like commodities with the value of gold. All right, the 16th Amendment. So you can thank the 16th Amendment and Woodrow Wilson for what is now what we call the federal income tax. So all that money that gets taken out of your paycheck by the feds, yeah, you can talk to Woodrow Wilson about that, but you can't because he's dead. This allows the IRS to collect revenue through taxes. This is how basically taxes have worked ever since. So before this, we did not tax based on income. We did what was called vice taxing. The federal government made a lot of its money off of things like alcohol, tobacco, gambling, those things. They would tax all those various forms of vice or bad behavior that was legal, and that's how they funded themselves, like the whiskey taxes, all those things. And then this amendment is signed into law and says Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes. All right, then we get to the 18th Amendment. This led to prohibition of alcohol, which we said no alcohol can be sold in the U.S., and it was later repealed by the 21st Amendment. So this is the Roaring Twenties, the very beginning of it, when you start seeing like speakeasies and people hiding their alcohol, that kind of stuff. So the U.S. is voted dry. So all of a sudden we went from being an alcohol-fueled country to no alcohol at all allowed. The Volstead Act was the enforcement arm. This is actually how we made sure that alcohol was destroyed and you could actually throw people in jail for consuming or purchasing or certainly making alcohol. Now, if you look at the bottom left, you'll notice that we think nowadays when someone says, they don't allow alcohol, we think of it as like a religious kind of old way of thinking. Back during this time period, alcohol and prohibition would have been viewed as a progressive women's rights movement. Not because women didn't like alcohol, but because what was happening was that women were staying at home, keeping the house, raising the children, and then the husbands would get their paycheck and go drink it all down at the saloon. So it's not like nowadays we're thinking about bars. Saloon was where men went to go drink with their friends and hang out with loose women and other terrible things, and then they come home with no money to take care of their family. So a lot of what we consider like the stereotype of, the Christian teetotaler, they don't like alcohol because of their religion. Back during this time, it was the women who were being disenfranchised, being harmed by their husbands making bad choices with their money, typically promoted by the alcohol industry. So that's why we look at the prohibition movement as a progressive movement era amendment. That's why we put those two and two together. So just have a little bit of historical empathy here. Don't think about the modern idea of anti-alcohol. Think about the idea of it back then and what it meant for women at the time. Carrie Nation was an anti-alcohol crusader. She destroyed whiskey bottles in saloons with her hatchet in the late 1800s, and they wouldn't arrest her for it because she was a woman. So she was very, very famous at the time. She'd run in and just start busting up bottles and breaking things apart, and no one would stop her because she was a little old lady, and they weren't about to go beat her up or anything. Some temperance cartoons here. This is an engraving called The Drunkard's Home versus the Temperance Home. Well, what happens when Daddy gets home from the bar? He comes home and just beats his wife, other terrible, terrible things. But the temperate home, there's reading, learning, the rearing of children and family, all these wonderful things. Basically to promote the idea of temperance, which is just in the word for not drinking. All right, the changing roles and influences of women. So the 19th Amendment, which is passed after Prohibition, granted women's suffrage. So women had fought for this since basically the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So when you took U.S. 1, you talked about this. There's Alice Paul, 1885 to 1972. She's basically credited with a lot of the idea of women's right to vote, that kind of stuff. All right, here's a description. Women suffragettes were picketing in front of the White House on a picket line for College Day, the picket line in 1917. So this is a time period right before women's suffrage is passed by the 19th Amendment. So how long must women wait for liberty? Because the idea was that, well, at this point we have obviously white Christian men who were able to vote first, and then it was all white men. And then after the slavery amendments passed, it was all African American men, as well as pretty much every racial minority as long as they were male. So at this point, we are now into the 20th century, almost 20 years in to the 1900s, and women still can't vote. So basically, this is the time has come, Mr. President kind of movement. And Kaiser Wilson. So basically, this is a dig at Woodrow Wilson saying, hey, you're taking care of Germans. Why aren't you looking at the suffering of women and how we're not self-governed? We can't vote. We can't self-govern ourselves. One of the reasons why Wilson justified going to war with Germany was the Kaiser was in charge. It wasn't a democracy. So he wanted to make the world safe for democracy, but now the women are saying, hey, Mr. President, you're talking about democracy in Germany. What about democracy here? Women can't govern themselves here. Why don't you take care of us first? That whole idea of like, look, don't be a hypocrite. Don't ignore women in favor of foreign influence. And there's the joint resolution that later became the 19th Amendment. And here's a really great cartoon. I actually like this one a lot. So basically it says what women can do and not have the vote. So you can be a mayor. So you can be elected to office in places and still not have the right to vote in elections, which is so crazy. You can be a nurse. You can be a mother. You can be a doctor or a teacher. You can be a factory hand. You can do all these various things as a female, but you don't get to vote. And now here's the juxtaposition, the comparison. What a man can be, and yet he doesn't lose his right to vote. He can be a convict. He can be a lunatic, completely crazy. And I don't know why they made the lunatic a guy dancing with what appears to be a radish, but I guess that was just crazy back then. Proprietor of white slave. So I think in this context, someone who is basically enslaving his wife, making them do labor for him. Unfit for service, so you can be injured, not even fit for the military. Or you can be a drunkard, all these things, and you still don't lose your right to vote as a man, while the women up top, being all noble and wonderful, don't even get the right to vote. All right, so this is women's suffrage and how it looked before the 19th Amendment. So if you look at the color, look at the keys, just take note of which states had complete voting rights, limited voting rights, and where women could vote in various states. Notice North Carolina, no voting for women. Shock. But a lot of states joined us in that company. There was a lot of states that did not have it. Now you'll notice a lot of these states out west, for some reason out here, they have voting rights. And the further west you get, the more voting rights you have. Part of that has to do with the fact the way these areas were settled. So you're talking about going west and settling towns. A town might have 100 people in it, and 50 of them will be women. So if you want votes to happen and people to get involved working that, you got to give them the right to vote because there's not many people. So these westward expansionist states where they needed more population, you had to incentivize people to go out there. One incentive might be, hey, women, if you go out west with your husbands and start a family and do some homesteading, start farming, you'll get the right to vote too. So they'd kind of push that out there as well, which is why you see that coloration on the East Coast being all brown with no voting rights. And as you get further west, they get more and more blue and yellow and red where they have more voting rights. All right, the changing of government power in the electorate. So let's take a look at Robert I'm going to mispronounce his name, Lafayette. He was a progressive governor of Wisconsin. He fought to regulate railroads and other big business. So Wisconsin, obviously a Midwestern kind of state. He basically was fighting railroads, which was a losing battle because they had so much power with people like Vanderbilt and other various entities out there. And they were he fought big business, which is kind of different to have governors and states fighting business and regulating the businesses within their state. All right, we've already gone over this in the past, but let's rehash it a little bit. An initiative was a progressive political reform that basically let citizens propose legislation, where before it was always legislators got to propose it. There was no direct involvement by citizens. Referendums were basically the idea, okay, we're not even going to have the legislators legislate this law. We're going to have it so we're going to make the law, and then we're going to let the citizens decide whether or not they want to approve or live by that law. So it's basically the citizens signing their own law by a vote. And then you have a recall election. A recall is where you say, yeah, that guy we elected, we hate him, so we're going to recall or vote to have him thrown out of office. It's almost like an impeachment, but by the people. And then you got the 17th Amendment, which called for the direct election of U.S. senators, and it was part of the progressive movement in 1913. So nowadays, all the way up till now, obviously, if you're voting for a U.S. senator, everybody in that one state votes for the U.S. senator, and it's a popular election. Before this amendment, it was done by state legislatures. So what you would do is, as a citizen of North Carolina, you would vote for members of the North Carolina legislature and the North Carolina Senate, and then they would choose who would become North Carolina's 2 U.S. senators. That's how it was handled. So it was a way to basically take power from the people or make it so it's less like mob rule. Now, what ended up happening was party bosses, people like Boss Tweed, they'd get their favorite legislators elected, and then they'd have a huge influence over who would become a senator. So this takes the influence away from people in corruption like party bosses and puts the influence directly in the hands of the people through popular election. So Boss Tweed's out, popular election is now in. Now, it took a long time for this to pass. It was originally proposed in 1826, so we're talking about this would have been the time period with, I'm going to mess the time up. It's either Andrew Jackson or John Quincy Adams is the time period we're talking about, all the way up until 1912. So it took almost 100 years. So this is the representation of when the little young congressman comes in, basically proposing this whole 17th Amendment, which would have been some other amendment at the time in 1826, and it took 90 years for it to finally pass. So it's been an idea for quite a while. And there's the joint resolution that was later passed as the 17th Amendment. All right. Commission plan. Oh, was it the 17th? I messed that up. Oh, yeah, 17th. Sorry. Going backwards. All right. Different plans of government. All right. The commission plan city government came out during the Progressive Era, in which elected officials ran the city or county governments. This is how most county governments work now. So you'll have the voters who elect the Board of Commissioners, and then they pass ordinances and control funds. Those various commissioners also are appointed by the Board of Commissioners, and they carry out policy. It's more direct control by the voters. The mayor-council city government plan. This is a little bit less progressive, as the people have less influence. So the voters will elect the mayor and the city council, and they'll then appoint heads of department and carry out policy. But notice that we have influence over these two guys, or this group and this person, but then the mayor has a lot of power to appoint the heads of various departments that carry out policy. So even if we elect these two guys, the mayor might pick people here we don't like. A good example would be like if we elect a mayor and then they appoint a chief of police that we hate. Well, he has the power to do that because it's one of the powers of mayors is to appoint a chief of police for that city. And then you got the city manager plan. So this is what we see more nowadays. We see more city manager style city governments than we do see just pure mayoral governments. This is a progressive movement. Basically, it takes a little bit more power out of the hands of just the straight mayor idea. So you have the voters elect the city council, they make policy, and that city council then hires the city manager. So this council of people, multiple members, they appoint the city manager who actually does all the jobs for head-to-head stuff. So you don't have this one mayor who's elected appointing everybody else. You have the council, which is more democratic because it's a larger group. They have to decide to hire a city manager who then kind of manages how things are done. It's a little more democratic, less prone to corruption because you have a whole council that's responsible for different districts within the city, and they can it's basically more democratic. The power is more spread out among all the council members as opposed to it just being in the mayor.